Hey friends, Veterans Day is on November 11th, but I wanted to start celebrating early by sharing some of the true stories behind my novels. So the first one I'm going to talk about is From Dust and Ashes, and that is my first novel that came out in 2003. Now, I first started writing, I was a homeschool mom. I started writing, I did magazine articles, I did a devotional book for Focus on the Family, but I really wanted to focus on a novel. And in 2000, when I got the idea for this book, I was on a research trip with two of my friends. So my friends Anne DeGraff and Cindy Martinezson Coloma, sorry, were both researching for novels, and they invited me to go to Europe with them. I was able to go for a week. Someone else was able to help homeschool my kids, be with them while I was gone, and I thought this is so cool. And I really was just along for the ride. Now, I had written some other novels before then, and they really hadn't got anywhere. But as we headed out on this trip, my friend Anne DeGraff, who had many published novels at the time, said, I think there's a story idea here for you too. And I just like, whatever, I'm just enjoying this mom time away. First time I've ever been to Europe. We were in the Netherlands, went through Belgium, went down to France, went through Germany, went to the Czech Republic, and then I was leaving out of Austria. So in a week, we were covering 6 countries. Well, on the day before I was able to fly out, we were supposed to meet a historian at Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Now, at the time, my friend Cindy was working on a novel, but she had already gotten the information. She's like, I don't know, I still have this appointment. I think we should go. And honestly, I wasn't looking forward to going to a concentration camp. I knew it would be depressing. I knew it would be so hard. But I remember walking in those gates, seeing those walls. We saw the ovens where so many bodies were burned. There was Jews inside the camp. There was political prisoners. There was some Americans inside the camp, and they had all been liberated in 1945. I learned so much just walking through, and then we met the historian. And as we stood there, and she told us some of the personal stories about the camp, I was amazed. So, the very first person into the camp, other than the American soldiers, which 23 Americans came upon the camp, a Red Cross soldier met them on the road, told them this concentration camp was there. They ended up opening up the gates, freeing the prisoners. The Nazis, because the Russians were very close, surrendered to the Americans. So here is 23 Americans with over 3,000 Nazi soldiers surrendered to them, and thousands of tens of thousands of very ill prisoners. Now, they were there, and then the first person inside the camp to help take care of the prisoners was a Nazi officer's wife. And she had been living outside the gates, and this is a true story. This is everything that the historian had told us at the time. She'd been living outside the gates, and her husband was an officer. He had fled. He knew the war was ending. He had escaped to try to get away from being captured, and she was there with her children, and she ended up going into the camp and feeding and taking care of the prisoners. And I remember standing there thinking this would be an amazing novel. To think about this woman who lived outside these gates, who knew it was happening, and as soon as she had the chance, she went in and started taking care of the very people that her husband was trying to kill. I thought, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And then heard about those 23 Americans that didn't even know a camp was there. They were on reconnaissance. They had no idea. This is, before the days when we had all these satellites and everything. They didn't even know the camp was there. And then coming upon this, and I thought this would be such an amazing story. So we went around town. I took more photos of the house where the woman lived. It was right along the Danube River, so this is all in Austria. Very quaint little village. It was hard to imagine that there was actually a concentration camp there in the town of St. Georgen, and then the Mauthausen, the big camp, was still there. So it's still concrete, and it was a quarry there, and so that is still there. But in the town, you can't even tell that there was so much pain and heartache and loss. And there had been a camp right there in the town also. So I remember coming home and telling my husband the story. I'd just, tried to find out as much as I could, talk to my agent, and she says, "Yes, you need to write a novel about this." And so I started thinking about that. I'd never thought I wanted to write historical fiction. I thought it would be too much work to write historical fiction. And she said, "You should see if any of those veterans are still alive." So I love the idea. Now, I ended up Googling the 11th. I don't even know if we had Google back in 2000. Did we? I ended up doing a web search and finding out about the 11th Armored Division. They had a website. And I emailed, they said, if you have any questions about this division, email this address. That is the secretary that was in charge. And I emailed and said, I want to write a novel about the 11th Armored Division, about the liberation of Mauthausen concentration camp. Do you know if any of the veterans who were there at the liberation were still alive? Within a day, the secretary ended up emailing me back with the addresses of these men. And out of the 23 men, some had passed away. I ended up writing letters to them and telling them who I was and that I would love to interview them. And within a week, 10 or 11 wrote back and said, "Yes, I want to tell you my story." And all of them invited me to their reunion. And so they were having a reunion, that a reunion every year of the men from the 11th Armored Division. So I'm like, okay, I need to figure out how to go. So my friend Cindy was able to go with me, and we told them, yes, we'll come. And so we flew into Chicago. We drove up to Kalamazoo, and I remember they were meeting for 3 days, and we told them we would come sometime on that first day. I believe it was a Thursday. And we walked in the doors, and this man came up to me, and he was the son of one of the veterans. He was the one that's the secretary of the organization. And he said, "Are you the writers?" And we said, "Yes." And they said, "These men have been waiting all day." And I was so overwhelmed because on the way there, Cindy and I were like, how are we going to get them to talk to us? Will they trust us? At the time, we had little mini tape recorders for us to record their interviews, which I still have all the little tapes with their interviews. And we did not have to worry about them wanting to talk to us. We ended up going in, and we dropped off our suitcases in our room, brushed our teeth, and ran downstairs. And there had been this room set up, and there was a table, and men were sitting there with their photo albums, waiting to talk to us. And there was more men lined up. So when those men were through, and I was just so overwhelmed because here I was, a homeschooling mom from Montana who dabbled in fiction, had never had anything published. Um, and suddenly, these veterans just were pouring out their stories to me and my friend Cindy. The first ones I talked to were Arthur and Charlie. The first one she talked to was a veteran named Thomas. And I remember Arthur and Charlie said they wanted to be interviewed together because they were best friends during World War II. And Charlie had been a replacement, and Arthur had took him under his wings, and they had been there at the liberation. And even though it had been, decades, 50 years, probably 55 years at this time earlier, they finished each other's stories. They would pick up where the other person left off, and the tears in their eyes as they shared about what it was like coming to this camp and seeing all the skeletal figures finally free, and so many, they talked about just walking through those gates and dropping dead because they just held out just to know that they were liberated and they had no more strength, and how they cared for them. Cindy talked to, again, Thomas. One of the other men I talked to, his name was Leroy Peterson, and he was the first medic there, and just how overwhelmed he was. He was 19 years old, and all these men were 18, 19. I don't even know if anyone was old, like 20. 18 and 19 years old going into these camps. And at 19 years old, Leroy was a medic. And we call him Pete. So for Peterson, everyone called him Pete. So Pete would go in there and as a medic would start caring for these prisoners, and just how overwhelming that it was. And so I just remember just being so blown away by their stories. I got them all dozens and dozens of recordings and photos with them. And on the Saturday night, there's a banquet, and they showed us how to foxtrot and dance with them. And Tony Petrelli was this little Italian that was from the Bronx that ended up living in Florida with his son, and he was like, "Come on, girls, I'm going to show you how to dance." And so, again, I was this Montana mom that was so completely blown away that God put me in that position. First of all, that He would trust me with this story. And I remember even going home after I had the interviews and the photos, and I was able to interview others who had been outside the camp. One man that I had met, his name was Willie, and he was 9 years old, and he grew up outside the concentration camps. And he talks about anyone that spoke out against the camp and against the Germans. Um, would be killed. They would just disappear or they would be killed. And how once he tried to throw food into the camp. His mother would give him food to throw into the prisoners, and he got caught. And a Nazi officer brought him home with a gun to his head and told his mother, "If anyone tries to feed them again, your whole family will be killed." And so, just hearing the perspective that we always talk about, like, how could people let this happen? But then talking to people who lived outside the gates and knowing that this woman who lived outside the gates. And, as soon as she had the chance, she was in there caring for the people. And I remember going home, and here I am again, homeschooling. We're still now trying to get my kids to do their multiplication tables and learn to read and all these things. And then working on this novel and being so like honored to be able to do it. I remember asking God, like praying, like, why me? Like, I don't even feel worthy. And he said, talk about liberation, about how once you were enslaved to sin and how I was your great liberator and came in and freed you and gave you liberation. And so the spiritual theme is just as strong within the book as the physical theme of what happened at this liberation. So I ended up working on the proposal, which, if you're not in the writer world, it means the whole story idea and 3 chapters. And so I ended up sending that in. Moody Publishers in Chicago is interested. They asked for 3 more chapters, which I wrote and sent in. So at the time when I actually got a book contract, I had never, ever, ever completed a novel. I'd only written 6 chapters, and they gave me a book contract, which, thank you, Moody Publishers. That does not happen today. You usually have to have the whole novel complete. Um, but they gave me a contract, and I ended up writing the novel and sent it to, by this time, was able to email some of the veterans, send it to them to read to make sure I got it right, and was able to go the next year to their reunion again, and actually 2 years later to the reunion with the book in my hand and show them. And one guy after another would come out like, "You don't have to tell anyone else, but I know that I'm the main character." And the next one would come, "You don't have to tell anyone else, but I know I'm the next character. I'm the main character." And so I love that so many of them, and the main character is Peter. Pete, I don't know. I don't know who it kind of might be based off, but it was so cool for them to be so excited that their stories was in a book. Now, one of the amazing things that's even a couple, actually, I'm going to share 2 amazing things above and beyond just getting my first novel published. First of all, the very first letter I got from a reader, it was through email, and it was from someone who found my name on the internet from Switzerland. She had read the German version, so it came out in English and also German, which I thought was really interesting. But she read the German version, and she said, this is kind of a spoiler alert, but you need to hear it. When your main character got on her knees and accepted Christ, I did too. And it was in broken English, and I thought, okay, here I am, still a homeschooling Montana mom, and God gave me the opportunity to write this story, and that's the very first letter I received, is someone who said she believes in Jesus now because of this book, which in another country, she read it in a language can't even, I don't even know how to count to 10 in German. So that was amazing. So that was one amazing thing. The next amazing thing was years later. I got an email from a lady named Hannah, and she said, I know that you wrote about the 11th Armored Division and you have this book. Did you know any medics? Because I was saved. I was a person that was saved. And I said, yes. And I said, Pete was the one I talked to. If it wasn't Pete that saved your life, he probably knows who was, because these are the people he worked with. And she emailed me back the next day, and her and Pete had talked, and he was the one that had rescued her life. And she had been a baby. She was born outside the concentration camp. Her mom was being transferred from another concentration camp to Mauthausen right before the end of the war. She was born, the mom, as they're walking up towards the camp, she was born, taken inside this concentration camp. And when Pete found her, the mom with his newborn, can you imagine being inside the concentration camp with your newborn baby? The baby was covered with sores from just the filth and the disease in the camp. And Pete had taken the time, there's tens of thousands of people around him, to lance all the baby's wounds and clean her wounds. And she survived. And she became a doctor. Her name is Hannah. And she was able, because she'd heard of my book, was able to connect with me and meet with Pete. And they were able to meet in Austria. Actually, the Austrian government heard their story, flew her over, flew Pete over, and they were able to meet. It's in the newspapers there. It was just an amazing story. And I'm like, God, again, I'm a homeschooling Montana mom that just wanted to get a book published. And it just really showed me that so much of writing, from this first book to every book I write, it's not about me. It's about what God wants to do. And God wanted to honor those veterans. God wanted to connect Hannah um, with the man who had saved her life when she was an infant. God wanted that young woman, 18 years old, in Switzerland, to get to know him in a real way. And he was able to use me and this novel to share that story. So that is amazing. I think so many times in our lives, again, here I was, I just want to write, get a book published. I'm going to be a published author. And God's like, okay, for a minute, it's not about you. And yes, I did become a published author, but I learned so much in that process. And I think with every book I write, it's so much more about what God wants to do, the story he wants to tell, and he needs a willing vessel. So if you're interested in writing, I have resources for that. You can go to writethatbook.club, writethatbook.club. But I would say, even before thinking about publication or writing it, just think about how you can just open your heart and be a willing vessel to whatever God wants to do. All right, so again, the book is From Dust and Ashes, a story of liberation. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever books are sold, or also on my shop, which is, if you just go to triciagoyer.com, and then you'll see on the top header it says shop, and it's available there too. You get a signed copy if you order it from my website. But that's the story behind From Dust and Ashes. And I will be sharing more of the true stories behind my novels um, through the days leading up to Veterans Day.